Imagine you're a Viking playing Nefertafel, or Viking chess as it's sometimes called. You bet most of your money on the game and lose, but your opponent is heading into battle tomorrow, and his chances aren't looking good. So you tell him you'll pay him back by the end of the week. A few days later, you hear that everyone who fought in the battle was killed. It looks like you won't have to pay your debt. Then, at the end of the week, you hear a knock at the door. You open it, and standing outside is the swollen, decaying corpse of your opponent. He's come to collect. Welcome to the mysteries of mythology, the Draugr. The Draugr wasn't a ghost, it wasn't quite a zombie either. It was the same person, but inside the dead body that had been buried. The body might be swollen, blackened, and unnaturally strong, but the mind had not completely gone. A Draugr could recognize people, it could speak, it remembered where it lived, what it owned, and who had wronged it. The picture that comes to my mind is Jack from An American Werewolf in London, the main character's backpacking friend who's killed by a werewolf, but keeps turning up a little more decomposed each time. He's fully conscious, complaining about rotting by the minute. So meeting one wasn't like being attacked by a mindless corpse. It was more like meeting the same unpleasant person you'd known in life, except now they were a lot stronger and much harder to kill. Most of what we know about them comes from the Icelandic sagas such as the Grettis Saga and the Eyrbyggja saga. These stories were written down during the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the Viking Age and after Iceland had become Christian. So they shouldn't be treated as a perfect record of what every Viking believed. Oh, if like me you thought a Viking was an ethnicity at school, it wasn't. It turns out it's more of an occupation, mainly a raider from Scandinavia, so you'd find it on a CV rather than a passport. Despite being written in Christian times, they still preserved an older fear. The dead might not simply stay dead. The Draugr could remain close to their farms, families and burial places, still holding on to the same grudges and possessions they had in life. Some stayed inside their burial mounds, guarding the weapons, jewellery and treasure buried with them. The sagas sometimes use another word, haugbúi, or however you pronounce it correctly, meaning barrow-dweller, for the dead who remained inside their burial mound rather than wandering around the countryside. Others left at night to attack travellers, kill livestock or return to the homes they once owned. Some stories even describe them climbing onto houses at night, stamping on the roof to terrify the residents. That's what made the Draugr different from most modern undead creatures. They didn't come back brain dead like a zombie, they came back still themselves, like the next story. Þórólfr, meaning Twist-Foot, was a wealthy landowner, but not particularly a pleasant one. He was proud, violent, and difficult to live with. He spent most of his life controlling the people and the land around him, and death wasn't going to change that. When he realized the end was near, he asked to be buried on a headland overlooking his property so he could continue watching over everything he owned. Which is weird because how would you watch over everything you owned unless you already knew you were going to come alive again? Anyway, after Þórólfr died, his body was placed in the burial mound exactly where he had requested. Before long, animals near the grave began behaving strangely. The oxen that had carried his body became uncontrollable. Birds that landed on the mound dropped dead, and sheep grazing nearby disappeared or were found killed. Then, people began dying. A shepherd saw Þórólfr outside his grave and tried to escape. The following morning, they found his body badly mutilated, with almost every bone in his body broken. Þórólfr was no longer simply sitting around guarding his burial mound. He was walking across the land at night, attacking animals, killing people, making the surrounding farms almost impossible to live on. When people started abandoning their homes, his son eventually decided that the body had to be moved somewhere more remote. When they opened the grave, Þórólfr's corpse had changed. It had swollen to an enormous size and become so heavy that several oxen struggled to pull it. Even dead, he was refusing to be moved from his land. They eventually dragged the body further into the mountains and buried it again. This time they built a high stone wall around the grave so that Þórólfr couldn't climb out. And we all know how well building a wall works. But after his son died, Þórólfr began walking again. He returned to the farms, killing people, animals, until no one was willing to live nearby. So the locals dug him up one more time, rolled his body down to the shore and burned it. A strong wind scattered some of the ashes, but they threw as much as they could into the sea. That should have been the end of Þórólfr, but as you know, it isn't. A cow later wandered down the shore and began licking the stones where the ashes had landed. The cow disappeared for a time, then returned pregnant. She eventually gave birth to an enormous grey bull called Glæmr. An elderly woman heard the crying calf and immediately warned them to kill it. She said it sounded like a troll, but they ignored her. Glæmr grew at an unnatural speed until he became a huge and violent bull. Eventually, he turned on his owner, Þórólfr, gored him and dragged him across the ground until he was dead. The saga never directly says that Þórólfr became the bull, but after the cow licks the ashes, gives birth to a monstrous calf, and that calf murders its owner, it isn't exactly difficult to see the connection. Even burning Þórólfr and throwing his ashes into the sea hadn't completely removed him. He'd spent his life refusing to surrender his land, his power, or his anger. Death had not changed who he was. It just made him much harder to get rid of. The Grettis Saga, one of the most famous Icelandic sagas, follows Grettir Ásmundarson, a warrior and outlaw known for his incredible strength and stubborn personality. But before Grettir ever faced a Draugr, the people of the remote Icelandic farm had their own problem. A man named Glámr was hired as a shepherd during the winter. He was a large, powerful man, but he was also arrogant as hell and difficult. The farmer warned him not to go outside on Christmas Eve. In Icelandic tradition, this was considered a dangerous night, when strange things could happen. Glámr ignored the warning and went out into the snowstorm and never returned. The next day, the villagers went looking for him. They eventually found his body, but there was something strange. Whatever had killed Glámr had done it with such force that they could not move him. So instead of carrying him back to the farm, they buried him where he'd fallen. As usual, that should have been the end of the story, but as you know, it wasn't. Soon after, strange things began to happen, just like they did with Þórólfr. People travelling through there were attacked, animals disappeared, and at night something roamed through the valley. The villagers realised it was Glámr. The dead shepherd had become a Draugr. Eventually, Grettir heard what was happening and decided to investigate. He stayed overnight at the farm, waiting for the creature to appear, and eventually it did. The two fought with such force that the building around them could barely survive. They crashed through walls, wrestled like two forces of nature, but eventually Grettir managed to overpower him. Glámr fell. But surprise, surprise, it wasn't over. As Grettir prepared to finish him, Glámr opened his eyes, and in the darkness Grettir saw his face clearly. The sight terrified him. The Draugr's power was not always physical either. Some stories describe them tormenting the living through nightmares and visions. With his final breath, Glámr placed a curse on him. He told Grettir that his life would become filled with bad luck, loneliness and fear. And according to the saga, that's exactly what happened. Grettir became increasingly isolated. His enemies multiplied. His family suffered and he developed a fear of the dark that stayed with him for the rest of his life. The fight with the Glámr is one of the reasons the Draugr became such a powerful figure in Norse storytelling, because defeating one was not always the end. Sometimes, the dead could still take something from the living. The problem with the Draugr was that killing it once didn't always mean it was gone. The stories often show people having to take extra steps to make sure the dead stayed dead. Some traditions focus on preventing the Draugr from rising in the first place. There were believed to be ways of making the body harder to move. The dead might have their toes tied together, objects placed on their chest, or even nails driven through their feet to stop them from walking if they returned. Another interesting belief was the idea of the corpse door. Because some people believed the dead could only return the way they left, a temporary opening was made in the house to remove the body. Once the funeral was complete, the opening was sealed again. But if the Draugr did return, there were more permanent solutions. The most famous method was the one Grettir used against Glámr. When the Draugr was defeated and then beheaded, the body was burned, and the ashes were scattered so that nothing remained that could return. Fire keeps coming up again and again in these stories because it was the final way to separate the person from the body. Once there was no body left, there was nothing for the Draugr to return to. What's interesting is that these ideas appear alongside Christian practices in the later Icelandic sagas. The stories were written after Iceland had converted to Christianity, so older beliefs about the dead often appear mixed with newer ideas about burial and religion. But burial mounds were not always places people avoided. Sometimes people entered them deliberately. I've left this chapter to the end as not all stories about the returning conscious dead are referred to as Draugr, and not all are about them being mean monsters. Sometimes people entered burial mounds deliberately. One of the most famous examples comes from the Saga of Hervör and Heidrek. The story follows Hervör, a warrior who wants to recover a powerful sword called Tyrfing. The sword was buried with her dead father and his brothers inside their burial mound, and as you can probably guess, the dead weren't exactly keen on giving it back. Hervör travelled to the burial mound and called out to her father, asking him to give her the sword. The burial mound opened and the dead warned her to leave, but Hervör refused. Eventually, her father gave her the sword, and Hervör left the mound with the weapon. In another story from the Eyrbyggja saga, we see a very different kind of return. A woman named Þórgunna dies while staying with a group of travellers. After her death, the people carrying her body fail to treat her belongings and burial properly. That night, Þórgunna returns, but instead of attacking them, she does something very unexpected. She prepares a meal for the group. The people are understandably suspicious. They've just watched a dead woman come back into the room and start cooking. But the food is prepared, everyone eats, and afterwards Þórgunna allows herself to be buried properly. I'm not sure if I'd have eaten. The Draugr survived for more than 1,000 years because it tapped into a fear that's much older than the stories themselves. We all know that dealing with someone's death is a difficult time, but the idea that someone could return unchanged, still carrying every grudge and every regret, is something much more unsettling. So what do you think? Was the Draugr simply a monster from Viking stories, or was it a warning about what happens when we refuse to let go? I said this was one of the things the Vikings feared, but there was something that crossed the skies that put the fear across the entire continent. To find out, watch this next video.